In cold weather climates, it might be a good idea to have a cover for your boat, especially if you're planning on doing some work. Hi, I'm Nika Waters, and welcome to the Boat Galley podcast. Today I'm sharing some details about our decidedly not very technical winter cover. Today's episode of the Boat Galley podcast is sponsored by My Island Wi-Fi, your go-to source for secure Bahamas internet. Planning on a visit to the Bahamas and wanting the security of unlimited Wi-Fi? Look no further. Featuring monthly plans with no long-term commitment, My Island Wi-Fi offers unlimited 4G hotspot rentals with no hidden fees or throttling. Visit myislandwifi.com to reserve your device now. That's myislandwifi.com. My Island Wi-Fi. Vacation without limits. I hadn't thought that our winter cover was anything fancy. In fact, I know it's not anything fancy because we've had the parts and put it together a number of times over the last 3 or 4 years. But when a reader asked me for some more details on that winter cover, I thought I might share it with you. Basically, it's a bunch of PVC tubes, some line, and some tarps. And yeah, there's a little bit of time that you have to spend being a little finicky putting it all together. One of the things that we very much like about this cover is that it's reusable. It does take a while to set up, but the parts are relatively inexpensive and it's fairly effective. We like to leave it up and it keeps us nice and dry and cozy down below, especially when we have a little space heater running. So number one is that PVC tubes form the frame. We've got 1/2-inch diameter size PVC tubes that we bought at the hardware store. The thing with PVC is that it's flexible, it's pretty easy to find, and it's also pretty easy to work with. That you aren't spending a ton of money on the different parts means that you can spend some time getting it exactly the way you want to and not worry about maybe having to trim off a piece of tubing that was too long. We bought enough of the tubing so that we could bend it over the boom. The boom forms the basis and the kind of top peak of a tent, as it were, and the PVC tubes just bend over that boom. It's secured to other tubes that we have running parallel along the edge of the boat, along the bulwarks. They're about probably knee height. And going forward from the mast going to the bowsprit, there's a tube that just goes straight down, again, to form kind of the tent ridge line that goes on there. We do have the end caps that you can buy for a PVC tube that we stick on the parts that go kind of jammed against the stanchion posts. And those end caps help to protect the deck from being scratched too badly. Do those things all stay in place? No, and if you look on my blog post, you can actually see some pictures, and it shows that the tubes have kind of come apart. That said, that we have it draped over the boom means that it is able to hold its shape and not bend down and drop down so that it's just sitting on the deck. The other part, given that the PVC tubes sometimes just come apart, is if you use line to sort of whip it together on the cross tubes in the places where they meet perpendicularly, the lines help to whip them together. We use small diameter, almost clothesline size or smaller line, because it's a lot easier to work and whip and securely fasten a fairly small diameter PVC tube. The same kind of line we use to sew the tarps together. And the tarps themselves form the cover. These are relatively heavy reflective tarps, the ones with reinforced grommets along the edges and the corners, not just kind of lightweight plastic that you've got. And the tarps make up the bulk of the protection. We on Calypso, which is a 28-footer with a 6-foot bowsprit and a 3-foot boomkin, we have 3 tarps in total. There are 2 larger ones and 1 smaller one. The smaller one for us goes forward from the mast, forward to the bowsprit. That one stops right at the mast, obviously, because I can't wrap it around. We don't cut any holes in the tarps. We don't do any kind of fancy collar or anything going around the mast. So the tarp for the front of the boat is long enough to reach very easily and comfortably from the mast all the way down to the tip of the bowsprit. There are 2 tarps that go aft of the mast. We've got one that sort of sews itself to the front tarp and it comes aft. It doesn't come all the way to the end, which is why we need 2 to overlap. So the only real gap that we have in terms of coverage on the boat is at the mast itself. But we do kind of wind up getting the edges pulled forward on either side and then back on either side so that it does the best job that it can in terms of not as much of a gap as you might have. The tarps are large enough to drape over the whole boat from side to side. So that means that they go over the tent ridge line and then down off the side of the boat, which means that moisture is encouraged to run off the boat and onto the ground, not pooling on the deck or in the cockpit or anything like that. The tarps are tied not only together, but also they're tied underneath the boat and tied to each other so that it holds the cover in place. It would be not unheard of for wind to pick up and take this tarp away, but with lashing the tarp to itself, kind of under the belly of the boat, it means that it's much less likely to do that. The big thing with this tarp and this cover that we have for Calypso is that it takes quite a while to set up. I'd say it probably takes about the better part of a day, maybe in part because it's not something we do all the time. We do it once a year at most. And remembering how it all goes together takes a little bit longer than it should, even though we have pictures and we mark on the tarp actually where it's tied together and where things go and which tarp goes where. The tubes take a while. We've taken them all apart, of course, to stow them because they're easier to stow not connected than if they're connected. So you have to set up the tubes, which you tweak and adjust and tie and lash together. You set the tarps up, you loosely tie them together, and then you go back and forth, and it's a tighten the lines and readjust and then tighten again, and back and forth until you're really, really happy with how it is tightly around the boat. And with the idea that you might be leaving for a little while and there might be some wind, that you're trying to keep rain and snow off of the deck. Our cover is the sort of thing that means that during the wintertime, we can much more comfortably, even though we need a lot more lights because, of course, it's dark, you're locking out a lot of the sunlight. But the tarps keep the moisture off the boat. It means that we can do things like work completely on the forward hatch and the center hatch and have just sort of temporary hatches on there right now. Those temporary hatches wouldn't last if they were out in the elements, and they would definitely let water and moisture in down below. This way, we can be working in the cockpit. We can have the companionway open if it's warm enough to be able to do that. If we are closing things up because it's cold out, we know that the rain, which on the northern neck of Virginia, we're probably going to have rain, cold rain more than we are going to have snow. But it does mean that we can be comfortable working down below. It protects some of the woodwork, protects the boat from moisture, and keeps leaves and all kinds of things out of the scuppers and the cockpit drains. There are lots and lots of options for boat covers. You can certainly spend lots of money and get a custom-made one, or you can create one yourself out of things as simple as PVC pipe, some line, and a few tarps. Regardless, when we get out to share an anchorage somewhere, I don't think we're going to be talking about winter covers, but the work that we're doing underneath our winter cover this year means we're going to be able to get out there much sooner. Thank you so much for listening to the Boat Galley podcast. We love it when we hear from our listeners. We love it when you leave a 5-star review, and we particularly love it when you tell your friends about us. Don't forget to subscribe, never miss an episode, and we'll see you next week.